The cry that changed everything. Savannah's historic district had a way of swallowing sound when the heat pressed down hard enough. By late afternoon, the magnolia leaves looked lacquered and still. The fountain in Monterey Square fell into a tired hush, and the streets around Bonaventure House, the old mansion on the corner lot with its iron lacework and terraces like stacked cakes, were more suggestion than place. Talia Brooks moved through that quiet like someone trained not to leave a ripple. At 29, with a nursing school acceptance letter taped above a kitchen sink she could barely afford and her mother's treatment ledger tucked into the back of her thrift store planner, she had learned how to make herself a steady, invisible current. Floors that gleamed, beds that sighed into perfect corners. The kind of order that rich people trusted without ever needing to ask who had arranged it. 3 weeks into the job and she knew Bonaventure's breath. The way the old pipes coughed before the second-floor shower came alive. The sigh the library doors released if you opened them too fast. The precise rhythm of Eli Rothwell's naps. That last one mattered most. The baby slept from 1 to 3, except on Tuesdays when the piano tuner came to plink through choppin' downstairs. On this Tuesday, the tuner was late, the house was hushed, and Eli should have been swaddled and dreaming under the mural of blue swallows that circled his ceiling. Talia was dusting the carved banister when it happened, a sound sharp enough to cut the heat, thin and urgent as a thread pulled too tight. A baby's cry, but not the sleepy, I've lost my pacifier kind. This was the startled, hurt, I need now kind. Every instinct Talia had honed in a life of caregiving to cousins, to neighbors' kids, to her mother on the bad days switched on at once, and she ran. The nursery door stood not just ajar, but oddly crooked on its hinges as if somebody had thrown it open too hard and let it bounce. The room smelled faintly of orange blossoms from the diffuser Genevieve liked to leave running, and something else underneath sharp, medicinal, out of place. Eli lay on the pale rug beside the crib, a small bundle gone wrong, cheeks flushed. Tiny mouth stretched into a cry that shredded what composure Talia had left. A thin, reddened welt traced along his hairline where he must have knocked against the crib rail on his way down. Genevieve Rothwell stood 3 steps away in a silk robe, the color of champagne, her eyeliner smudged at the corners like a party had ended hours ago and she hadn't remembered to remove it. One jeweled slipper hung off her foot. The other lay upside down near a tipped bottle of expensive face serum, its contents gleaming in a small slick that caught the window light. "Don't touch him," she said, and if her words weren't slurred, they were at least frayed, a maid of threads, kind of imperiousness that didn't match the panic flickering behind her eyes. "He's my son." Talia didn't stop moving. She went down on one knee, the rug imprinting its trellis pattern into her skin through the fabric of her pants, and slid one hand behind Eli's neck the way she'd learned in the community first aid course, keeping his head steady while she scanned him for anything obviously broken, limbs moving, lungs bringing in air with a sobbing hitch, pupils equal, no gush of blood. She spoke out loud more to anchor herself than to persuade anyone in the room, a steady stream of what comes next. "I'm with you, baby. I'm here. You're okay. I've got you. We're going to get help." She reached for her phone with the hand not supporting him. "Stop," Genevieve repeated, stepping forward too fast and then catching herself on the edge of the bureau, the scent of her perfume arriving like a curtain. "There's no need for a doctor?" Talia's voice came out calm but iron flat, and in the doorway appeared the one person in this house who could make a directive sound like a law. "Miss Brooks," said Mrs. Pembroke, the head housekeeper, starched into her uniform the way a soldier fits into his dress blues. Every hair was pinned, every syllable aligned. "We do not make calls without Mr. Rothwell's instruction. If there is a concern, you fetch me?" Eli whimpered again, a sound that didn't understand protocol. Talia's finger was already pressing 9. "Mrs. Pembroke," she said without looking up because looking down at Eli kept her centered, kept her from fanning into the thousand what-ifs streaking through her head. "I will answer for any break in protocol you assign me later. Right now a 1-year-old has a visible head impact. He must be seen." "That's not an opinion." Genevieve tried again to stop her, long fingers fluttering in a gesture half graceful, half lost, the word "no" catching in her throat like a fishbone. Talia's call went out anyway. The dispatcher's steady voice turned the room into shapes. Address confirmed, age confirmed, consciousness confirmed. A unit on its way. The next minutes were a tangle she would replay in clean slices in later hours. How Genevieve reached down, and not for Eli, but for a smear of shimmered powder. Near the vanity, a reflex that said more than any speech. How Mrs. Pembroke stepped between Talia and the door with a face like a closing safe and reminded her to mind the boundaries. As if a border could exist in a room where a baby's sobs bounced from wall to wall. How Eli, even in distress, turned his damp face into the soft dark of Talia's sleeve like she could be ashore. "You overstep," Mrs. Pembroke pronounced in a hush. "You people do not understand the way things are handled." The phrase landed in the space between them like something rancid, not said outright but implied well enough that its meaning needed no translation. Talia had learned long ago that some insults came dressed in careful velvet, as if politeness could scrub their sting. She put her body between Eli and every pair of eyes that wasn't seen clearly and lifted him just enough to keep him upright against her shoulder, rocking without thinking the way her mother had taught her, using a sock full of rice as a newborn stand-in when Talia was 12 and determined to volunteer in the church nursery. "You can file your complaint in triplicate," she said, and then the siren arrived as if summoned by the last syllable, its peal snapping the house out of its curated trance. Paramedics moved in like competents, made flesh gloves pulling on with a snap. A soft-voiced medic named Ortiz crouching at eye level with Eli and coaxing him with a crinkly foil blanket as if it were a toy. Another medic taking in the room in a sweep that paused at the hint of what gleamed on the vanity and moved past it with a professional mask settling into place. They asked the questions Talia had already answered. Fall? Height? Loss of consciousness? Vomiting? She gave the details as precisely as she could and added what she'd smelled, what she'd seen, what she hadn't seen. She didn't embellish and she didn't soften. Genevieve hovered with a hand at her throat, her mouth forming, "I'm fine," even when no one was looking at her. And when the medic asked whether the child's father was present, Mrs. Pembroke said in a tone that could chill tea, "Mr. Rothwell is in Atlanta on business." As if the mere naming of his whereabouts should rearrange reality into something less inconvenient. "We'll need to transport," Ortiz said, kindness layered over certainty. "It's standard for head trauma in infants even when they look okay. He'll be monitored and probably scanned." "Ma'am," he added to Talia, "you've done everything right." The ride down the stairs felt like 1,000 miles, though later Talia would marvel at how careful the paramedics' hands were with both baby and banister, how they swaddled Eli into a nest of straps and soft padding that turned a hard gurney into something like a well-tucked bed. Genevieve walked beside them for 2 steps and then faltered, pressing a hand to the wall as if the house had shifted under her. "I will come," she said, but when she reached for her purse, she couldn't find it, and when she reached for her robe's tie, it came loose, and by the time she had gathered herself, the paramedics were moving purposefully toward the door. "I'll ride behind," Talia told Ortiz, and he nodded as if this were the most natural thing in the world. On the front steps, the heat hit them like bathwater. The piano tuner stood on the walk with his tool bag and a face full of alarm. Neighbors on their evening stroll slowed, eyes widening, lips poised to turn what they saw into neighborhood lore. Eli cried until the ambulance door closed behind him and the air conditioning swallowed the sound, and then he hiccuped into quiet. One tiny arm reaching out in that reflexive way infants have when they decide a thing is safe. He found Talia's finger. He held on. Bonaventure House, for all its moneyed sheen, was built on old rules, and one of those old rules arrived 20 minutes later in the shape of a man in a slate suit, whose face looked like it had learned to smile only for photographs. Mark Rothwell had been born into a family that built hotels and an armor that expected the world to bend. Even hurrying across a hospital waiting room, he managed to look like he had choreographed the place. "Where is my son?" was his first sentence, and he delivered it to the nurse at the desk as if she were a concierge. When he turned and saw Talia, a flicker of surprise crossed his features, recognition rearranging itself into a convenient story. "Who are you?" he demanded, though he knew People like Mark Rothwell knew everyone under his roof the way a general knows where the foot soldiers sleep. "I'm the housekeeper on duty," Talia answered, keeping her posture steady, her words smooth. "I found Eli on the—" floor. He hit his head against the crib. "The paramedics have him. He's being assessed." She did not say that Genevieve had been unsteady, that something sharp had hung in the air around her, that under her robe and self-possession was a woman, being outpaced by circumstances she couldn't quite master. She spoke of the child, because that was the only thing that mattered here. Mark's eyes cut toward the automatic doors as if he could summon the pediatric team with a glance, and then back to Talia, landing on her like blame might land better than fear. "Found him on the floor," he repeated, testing the sentence for an angle. "Doing what, exactly? Where were you?" He didn't say what he was thinking. He didn't say the word he had ready for a woman in a uniform with dark skin and good posture and a steady voice who had dared move without permission, but its shape hung in the space between them. Talia swallowed her tiredness. "Where I was supposed to be," she said, not apologizing for the rest. A nurse with a kind mouth and firm hands approached just then, St. Joseph's no-nonsense guardian, the kind of woman who smelled like peppermint and starch and the certainty that parents and bosses alike bowed to triage. "Mr. Rothwell," she said, extending a businesslike hand, "I'm Nurse Alvarez. Your son is stable. We're observing him and preparing for imaging. He's in excellent care." She pivoted toward Talia with a flicker of recognition. "You're the one who stayed calm?" she added in an undertone. "Thank you." Later there would be tests that hummed and lights that flared, the thump of imaging equipment like a distant drum. There would be a late-night pediatrician with kind eyes who explained that babies were resilient and that caution was not an accusation, and forms that turned fear into boxes to check, and monitors that blinked out steady heartbeats as if they could broadcast relief. But in the first hour, what there was most of was waiting and the old, creaking machinery of blame trying to locate the nearest, safest target. "You will not touch my child again without instruction," Mark told Talia when the nurse stepped away, as if an after-the-fact rule could undo the fact that she had been the one to put her body between calamity and the boy he loved. "You will not make calls. You will not involve anyone. We handle our own." There it was again, the word "we" used like a gate. Talia had been raised to answer cruelty with clarity, because otherwise it multiplied. "Your son cried for help," she said, not cold and not pleading, just a recital of what had happened. I answered, "You can fire me for that if you need to. You cannot erase it." Mark looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing whether to swat a fly or stare down a storm, and then he turned away because a doctor had appeared and he knew to whom power deferred in this building. Genevieve arrived shortly after. She had changed into a linen dress in the meantime and reapplied her lipstick, but the careful lines couldn't hide the tremor in her hands. She floated into the waiting room like someone entering a premiere and held her face as if it might crumble if she let it move. When she saw Talia, the tremor stilled, replaced by a brittle brightness. "You," she said, as if it were an accusation. "You frightened him." It was such an odd thing to hear that Talia blinked. "He fell," she said gently. "He needed attention." "He needs calm," Genevieve countered, as if serenity could press a welt back into normal, as if quiet were stronger than gravity. Under the powder and poise was something raw fear, and the kind of love that flails when it sees its own reflection fail. Talia bit down on the easy answer sitting on her tongue and chose another. "He needs all of us to choose him first," she said. Genevieve's jaw twitched, and some other answer might have grown there if Mrs. Pembroke hadn't arrived at that moment to occupy the space with a kind of old-world decorum that said, "Let us remember who brings the silver, who uses it, and who decides what counts as an incident worth naming." "Miss Brooks," she said, "you will return to the house? We will manage from here." The ride back in a lift, scented with pine and faint cigarette smoke, felt like traveling in a different life. Savannah squares unspooled themselves outside. The window-live oaks like green cathedrals, tourists ambling with pralines, a street musician coaxing something mournful from a trumpet. Talia's phone buzzed with a litany of ordinary things that felt obscene in their ordinariness. A reminder from the pharmacy, a sale at the discount grocer, a message from her cousin asking if she could stop by Saturday to help with a science project involving paper-match planets and 20 glue sticks. By the time she stepped back through Bonaventure's side entrance, the house had tucked itself back into its brochure, the crisis filed in the drawer where such inconveniences went, the piano tuner finally coaxing the scherzo into tune. In the staff pantry, Rosa from Linens pressed a wrapped brownie into Talia's palm without a word, and James, the newest footman, all nervousness and earnestness, murmured, "You did the right thing," as he passed carrying a tray of cut fruit. In the upstairs hall, Mrs. Pembroke stood like a portrait. "A word," she said, and led Talia into the sewing room where extra curtains hung like quiet witnesses. "We maintain a standard here," she began, smoothing an invisible wrinkle in the air. "That standard includes discretion. The family will decide how to address this. You will say nothing. You will sign nothing without my review. You will avoid the nursery unless explicitly called." There was warning in the cadence, but there was history too, old and ugly, the kind that told women shaped like Talia to keep their righteousness tidy, to fold it and put it away because people with glass-fronted cabinets did not like the look of it. "I won't gossip," Talia said. "I won't embellish. I will tell the truth if I'm asked." "By whom?" Mrs. Pembroke's eyebrow arched. "By whom do you anticipate being asked? The press? The neighbors? The sort of people who love to imagine the interior of other people's houses?" "By a doctor," Talia replied evenly. "By a social worker if one is called. By anyone whose job is to make sure a child is safe. I won't say more than what happened, and I won't say less." The room seemed to tilt a degree. Mrs. Pembroke's mouth thinned. "You are very certain of your role," she said. "I am," Talia answered. And it was true in a way that went beyond this house, the role she had learned at her mother's bedside, at the public clinic where she sat in plastic chairs for hours with a file in her lap, at the community baby shower where she was the one who knew how to check a strap for give. "And if that certainty costs me," she added, "I'll pay it." Night arrived either too quickly or not quickly enough. Talia lay on the narrow mattress in her small room under the eaves, the ceiling slanting so low above the headboard that if she sat up too fast she would bump it. She thought of Eli's hand curled around her finger, the instinctive human seeking of anchor. She thought of the words she had not said to Mark Rothwell, the ones that would have been true and would have made nothing better. She thought of her mother 2 bus lines away and the way worry wore grooves into the body. She made herself breathe in 4s and out in 6s because that was something she could control. The house was never quiet, not really. It creaked and shifted and hissed the way old things do when you turn the light off and expect them to sleep. Somewhere near the laundry, a machine hummed. Somewhere on the second floor, a door side shut. Somewhere not quite identifiable, a soft pop sounded like a cork being eased out of a bottle. She had almost drifted when a slip of fear thrummed through her. She sat up, then stood, then opened her door to the hallway and found James there, his hand lifted like he had been about to knock. "Sorry," he whispered, flushing. "I didn't mean to, Mrs. Brooks. I thought you should know the upstairs corridor, the little dome camera outside the nursery. There's a gap in the feed. I was helping security review something, and there's an hour missing before the paramedics came. They said it's a glitch, but I've never seen one like that." Sleep, then, would be a fiction. Talia thanked him, took her cardigan from the hook, and went to the little staff office where a plan might be born. Plans were her coping mechanism, the way she wrote the world back into sense when it tried to spill off the page. She wrote down what she knew in a neat hand that had calmed more than one flustered clerk. Time of cry, time of call, observations. Paramedic Ortiz's surname because details mattered when people with money tried to make other details, the only ones anyone remembered. She wrote down Nurse Alvarez's name and the note to send a thank you. She wrote down the word backup and underlined it because the missing footage told her what she had already guessed. The people who preferred driven narratives also preferred erasures when narratives threatened to run wild. If the house system had gaps, perhaps the manufacturer's cloud did not. If protocols bent toward image management, perhaps procedures outside these walls bent toward documentation. She did not imagine herself a crusader. She had a bus pass, and a stack of bills and the kind of practical imagination that made casseroles stretch 2 more days. But she knew stubbornness when it settled into her bones. In the morning, she decided she would call the security vendor listed on the laminated card by the monitor. She would ask hard but polite questions. She would keep the baby at the center of every sentence. At dawn, the squares were still and the air smelled like salt, and Talia walked to the bus with a tote bag on her shoulder and the vendor's number programmed into her phone. She had learned to expect stone walls and found, to her surprise, a technician with a voice like a Sunday school teacher, careful and kind. Cloud retention is automatic, he explained, unless the account holder has manually restricted it. We comply with the owner's requests, of course, but the defaults are set to preserve 2 weeks of footage. If something's missing locally, the cloud may still have it. We'd need a written request from Mr. or Mrs. Rothwell to release a copy. If the system shows a gap, Talia asked, is that ever a sign someone tampered? The technician was silent long enough for her to know he was choosing truth. It can be, he said, but sometimes it's nothing more than a firmware update that didn't take. I can't say without looking. She thanked him, wrote his first and last name under the word backup, and then called St. Joseph's to check on Eli because she needed that kind of news in her bloodstream. Stable, they said, observing no worrisome changes. A relief so acute it made her knees feel hollow. When she returned to Bonaventure around 9, the house was strangely hushed. The piano tuner had gone. The florist had come and left pale peonies. Everywhere like apologies. In the study, the door stood open and Mark's voice reached her in tones smooth enough to pass for friendly until you realized there were needles laced through them. We'll contain the story, he was saying to someone on speakerphone. The child is fine, that's the headline. There is no other. Genevieve was tired after a difficult night. A housekeeper overreacted. We support our staff while reminding them of boundaries. We donate to the Children's Hospital to underscore our commitment. Dropped the statement. Talia stood there another heartbeat, allowing herself the small indulgence of disliking him before she put the feeling away like a shirt she couldn't wear to work. She wasn't naive. She knew that where money collected it formed currents, and that those currents carried stories to preferred shores. She also knew there were some rocks even money couldn't move. The truth, when you placed it carefully, had its own weight. In the afternoon, while polishing the balustrade, she heard a small sound from the stairwell and turned to find Genevieve sitting on the 4th step, shoeless, her head tilted against the spindles as if she were a creature who had run and finally folded. For a moment they looked at each other without the architecture of classes between them, the way women look when they recognize in each other that unbearable mixture of longing and exhaustion. He's all right, Genevieve said, and to Talia's shock there were tears in her voice, fragile and furious at having been caught. They said he's all right. But the bruise, she pressed her palm to her sternum. It looks like failure on me. The admission hung between them like a piece of silk. Talia sat on the step below, not facing her because sometimes two people can only speak if they don't have to bear witness to each other's faces. The bruise looks like gravity, she said softly. Happens quicker than anyone can react. What happens next looks like love. That's the part we get to choose. Genevieve's laugh was small and terrible. You talk as if choice belongs to me. It does, Talia said, and she meant it in more ways than one. A beat passed, and then the shutters clicked shut in Genevieve's eyes, and she stood. And the old choreography resumed. Mrs. Rothwell, for whom appearances were doctrine, Miss Brooks, for whom truth was duty, that night. After the family returned from the hospital with a sleepy Eli and a packet of discharge instructions and a signature cure that read, "Keep him calm. Watch for changes," Bonaventure again performed its old magic of absorbing news and releasing only selected versions. a photographer from a lifestyle magazine, that had planned a feature on the house's restoration for a summer issue was politely told to delay. Staff were reminded to use the side entrance. The cook prepared chicken soup that smelled like 1952. And reassurance. And yet the house could not seal out everything. Rosa came to Talia's room with a scrap of gossip subdued into concern. "Security says yesterday's file shows nothing 1 hour before your call," she murmured. "Nothing, like a pause. Like sleep." James arrived later with a different scrap. This one not rumor, but fact. "I saw the cloud dashboard when the tech logged in," he confessed, cheeks reddening with the risk he'd taken poking around systems that weren't his. "There's a way to pull a remote copy. It sends a confirmation code to the account email. If we could get the code, we could pull the hour." He looked at his shoes. "I shouldn't know this." "You do," Talia said, "and now I do." On the third night after the fall, when you would think the world might have moved on by half an inch, Talia woke to a sound that wasn't in the house so much as in her bones, the exact frequency of a baby's startled cry, this time only one note, long before it was smoothed into quiet. She sat up, heart quickening, and knew how the next days would lay themselves out like steps on a hidden staircase. She would go to the hospital and bring Nurse Alvarez a bag of the good coffee from the market on Whitaker because gratitude mattered. She would ask, careful as a needle passing through silk, whether a note had been made in the file about the odor in the nursery, about the sheen on the vanity, not to indict but to keep the record from being bleached into something antiseptic. She would visit the security office under the pretense of checking that the service entrance camera, the one that always overexposed if the sun hit it wrong, was still misbehaving, and while there she would read the vendor contact information into her phone as if copying a number for an errand, not a fight. She would write, in the notebook now fat with observation, the names of people who might step forward if asked, the piano tuner who had seen the ambulance lights, the neighbor who had paused on her dog walk, the paramedic whose practiced eyes said more than his paperwork could. She would be respectful and relentless. She would tell the truth even when it snagged in her throat, what she didn't know. What none of them knew was that the house had one more secret tucked into its bones. That, behind the nursery's wainscoting, history had left a narrow maintenance passage, the kind of crawlspace builders used when wiring was an afterthought and servants were expected to be the household's veins. Someone else knew. Later, much later, when the city had taken sides and the story had climbed out of Bonaventure's hedges and into polite living rooms, Talia would remember that first week and understand how the ground had shifted under her feet before. She even learned the word for the shift. On the fourth evening, as the setting sun melted into the river and the sky went gold in a way that made Savannah look like a painting of itself, she paused outside the nursery door to listen for Eli's breaths, that soft seashell whoosh. She heard them steady, lest something else as well, a faint click like a small latch easing into place behind the wall. It could have been settling wood. It could have been nothing. It could have been the first note of a symphony she had not asked to conduct. She stood there breathing, hand on the doorframe, and promised the sleeping boy a thing she could not guarantee but would die trying to make true, that she would be the person who answered when he cried, not because she was paid to, not because the job demanded it, but because choice lived in the moment. A woman in her position decided the rules weren't the law, and the child's safety was, when the phone call came from her mother's caseworker the next morning to discuss a lapse in coverage and a copay that was more than Talia had earned the last 2 shifts combined. The worry that rose in her throat wasn't the kind that could be swallowed. It burned. She stepped into the back garden with its citrus trees and stone path and breathed in the sharp, clean smell as she let herself feel the weight of everything at once, the boy upstairs with a tender bruise, the man in the study arranging stories like furniture, the woman on the stairs whose smile was a bandage and a blade, the ledger in her planner that did not forgive arithmetic. She had the wild thought that the universe never asked whether a person was ready for a test. It simply administered it. She also had the calmer thought that everything she needed to pass this one she already carried. A spine, a voice, a network of ordinary people who did not mistake money for morality. She dialed the security vendor again. "This is Talia Brooks from Bonaventure," she said, her voice careful. "I'm calling about a standard retrieval request. I'd like to know exactly what form the owner needs to authorize a cloud pull, and how quickly, once submitted, a read-only copy can be generated for medical review." There was a pause, then the warmth of the technician's tone like a small blessing through a wire. "If the owner grants permission today, we can deliver. A locked export within 24 hours, he said. It will include timestamps and integrity hashes that show it hasn't been altered. That's for courts and doctors, you understand? Chain of custody? You've worked in healthcare?" "I've worked in the waiting room," Talia said, which was a kind of expertise no resume captured. "And I'm just the housekeeper," she added, not because it was all she was, but because the world insisted on hearing that first. "You're the one who called an ambulance," the man said gently, and then the line clicked with the sound of a keyboard. "I'll email the form to the household account. For what it's worth," he added, "systems fail, but the truth has a way of persisting in the margins." By dusk, the paperwork had begun to move the way molasses moved in January, slow, inevitable, sticky. Mark signed what he needed to sign because the pediatrician's note had recommended review of incident context, and because his lawyer had advised him that cooperating looked like confidence. The export protocol spun up somewhere in a server, far from Bonaventure's draped windows. Inside the house, a new equilibrium pretended to settle. Eli slept, waking twice to drink and once to cry because even babies have nightmares they cannot name. The cook sent up a tray with chamomile and 3 sugar cookies shaped like stars. Rosa left a lavender sachet under Talia's pillow and a post-it that said simply in cramped script, "We see you." And on the back stairs, in a pocket of quiet where air had always seemed cooler than the rest of the house, Mrs. Pembroke arranged her face into the serenity of a woman whose job was to make trouble evaporate and whose lineage taught her that trouble wore certain faces more readily than others. "Miss Brooks," she said when Talia came down to stack glassware for the morning, her tone colorless. "I trust we understand each other now." Talia looked at the older woman and saw not a villain but an apparatus, the human gears of a house that had been operating a certain way since before she was born. She also saw something like fatigue in the line of Pembroke's shoulders, and in an odd flash that came from nowhere she saw the younger Pembroke she had never met, maybe a girl from a mill town under a good coat who had trained herself into crispness because crispness collected a paycheck. Compassion flickered. Then Talia put it down in the interest of survival. "We understand," she said. "We understand that a baby cried, and I answered, and I will answer again." Mrs. Pembroke's lips compressed until they were almost invisible. "You will answer your supervisor," she said. "And you will remember that this family's privacy is sacrosanct." Talia's voice, when it came, surprised even her. It was soft and enormous. "Children don't belong to privacy," she said. "They belong to protection." After midnight, Talia went to the nursery, not to hover she knew the difference, but to pass the door, and let her body absorb the sound of Eli's even breath through the wood. She stood a moment longer than needed, one hand on the frame, and the mural of swallows on the other side, painted by an art student who had bartered her work for rent 2 summers ago, seemed to rustle even though no air moved. The building made its nighttime sounds, the tick of cooling pipes, the barely audible hum of the new camera that had replaced the one James warned her about, the faintest brush of something behind the wall that could have been mouse, history, or a woman's plan. In the space between those sounds was a vow, and it belonged to her. She carried it back to her room, tucked it into the notebook, wrote it as a line at the bottom of the page with all the names and times and notes. "When the cry comes again, I will be there, and if they try to write me out of the story, I will write myself back in with evidence, with witness, with the stubborn light the truth insists on throwing even into rooms made to look perfect." By morning, a courier arrived at Bonaventure with a padded envelope addressed to the household office. Inside lay a USB drive with a tamper seal and a form letter from the vendor. Per authorization, retained footage delivered. Export includes integrity hashes. Contact support with chain of custody questions. The seal broke with a small sound that seemed too meek for the weight it carried. James stood beside Talia at the tiny staff computer like a kid at the world's most consequential science fair. The file tree populated, lines of time like rungs on a ladder. They clicked open the hour before the ambulance, and the nursery appeared cool light. Swallow mural, crib in its corner, the tiny universe of a child's room waiting for a human to complicate it. And then movement, a figure in a silk robe entering the frame as if she had been drawn there, a baby rising from sleep startled by something unseen, a woman swaying a fraction, an arm extending, the small body of a boy leaning toward gravity. Because gravity is patient. Talia's hand found the back of the chair and gripped. Not because vindication tasted sweet, it didn't, but because the story would not be allowed to warp again without a fight. "We don't make copies," James whispered, as if saying the thing out loud invited lightning. "We make a backup for the attorney," Talia said, practical to the end. "And one more for the doctor. And then we wait for the next rule that needs breaking." She did not know how many of those rules there would be. She did not know that what hid behind the wainscoting would matter, that alliances would shift, that affection would rise to meet her in a shape she had not expected, and suspicion would drag on her ankles like wet cloth. She did not know that the sentence, "You people do not understand the way things are handled," would return to her later, not as a wound, but as a map for every system she would learn to navigate and append. What she knew, standing in the tinny glow of the staff computer while the swallows on the other side of the wall kept circling, was that the first battle had been fought and the second was already queuing itself up. She squared her shoulders, slid the drive into a small envelope she would address to herself and the future, and went upstairs because there were sheets to turn down and a baby to check and a city that, whether it knew it or not, had just become a witness. The accusations, the Rothwell estate had always been a place where silence held more weight than words. The carpets were thick, the chandeliers heavy with crystals, and every hall seemed designed to muffle conflict into a kind of genteel hush. But after Eli's fall, silence itself had turned into something hostile, like the whole house had been, instructed to hold its breath and wait for a scapegoat. Talia sensed it the morning she returned from the hospital to resume her duties. Nothing was said to her outright, not by Rosa, not by James, not even by Mrs. Pembroke, yet the weight of glances carried the same sharpness as accusation. In the staff dining room, the conversation shifted when she entered. In the laundry, whispers cut off when she stepped past the racks of drying linen. The air was thick with something worse than open blame. It was the quiet verdict of people, too afraid of the Rothwells to defend the one who had broken an unspoken rule. Mrs. Pembroke summoned her to the sewing room again. That narrow chamber with faded floral curtains where discipline was delivered under the guise of conversation. The older woman sat stiffly, her fingers tapping a rhythm against the armrest of her chair. "Miss Brooks," she began, her tone both clipped and weary, "I've received word that Mr. Rothwell has expressed serious doubts regarding your conduct. He feels you acted outside your position. He feels you dramatized matters that did not require such interference. As you can imagine, this family's reputation is as delicate as the lace you fold for the dining table. Any suggestion of negligence, any hint of scandal is unacceptable." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And you have now introduced both." Talia held her hands steady in her lap, though her pulse thrummed hard against her wrists. She could almost feel Eli's small weight still pressed against her shoulder, the tiny grasp of his fingers. "I acted because a child was hurt," she said, her words calm but firm. "I will accept any reprimand you assign, but I will not accept the idea that doing nothing was the proper course. If I had stood still, if something worse had happened, we would not be discussing inconvenience, we would be discussing tragedy." Mrs. Pembroke's mouth tightened. "You speak as though you are the arbiter of truth, but truth is not a matter for housekeepers. Truth is what this family chooses to present to the world. Do you understand? If Mr. Rothwell says his son had a mild tumble and was attended to, then that is the truth. If Mrs. Rothwell says she was resting and entirely in command of herself, then that is the truth. You, Miss Brooks, are paid to serve, not to define reality. The words fell like stones, and for a moment Talia felt herself shrinking under the weight of them. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone the night before, weak but still trying to reassure her daughter instead of being reassured. She thought of the security vendor's voice, hinting that the truth could still exist in the cloud, preserved beyond tampering. And she thought of Genevieve, brittle and trembling on the stairwell, confessing that her son's bruise looked like failure carved into her skin. Talia drew in a steadying breath. "With respect, Mrs. Pembroke," she said, "truth does not belong to the Rothwells. It belongs to whoever chooses to see clearly and refuses to look away. And I will not look away." The conversation ended, with the kind of frost that promised reprisal. By that afternoon the consequences had begun. Tasks she had never been assigned before suddenly filled her schedule, endless inventories of linens, double shifts polishing brass, the humiliating demand that she scrub the marble steps in view of the other staff. It was not the work that cut her, but the intent behind it, a public reminder that she could be made small, that she could be bent if she did not bend herself. Some staff looked at her with pity. Others, yet even as she endured the punishments, Talia sensed something shifting beyond the household's walls. At St. Joseph's Hospital, Nurse Alvarez had spoken to a social worker, and that social worker had taken notes that did not disappear into polite silence. By the third day, a letter had arrived from Child Protective Services requesting a wellness check, couched in neutral terms but carrying the quiet force of oversight. Mark Rothwell received it in his study, his expression carved into stone, and by evening his displeasure had rolled downhill onto everyone in the house. Genevieve wept through dinner, insisting she was being persecuted. Mark muttered about opportunists and vultures. Mrs. Pembroke muttered about outside interference. And in the kitchen, Rosa whispered to Talia, "You made them nervous. That means you hold power, even if they'll never admit it." Power was not what Talia wanted. All she wanted was to know Eli would be safe, that the bruise on his forehead would heal without being turned into a story that excused negligence. But the more she tried to focus on him, the more the house twisted the narrative. One morning, when she entered the nursery to change the linens, she found Genevieve already there, her robe tied neatly, her hair perfectly pinned. The baby cooed softly in his crib, reaching toward a toy, but Genevieve's eyes were fixed not on him but on Talia. "You think you've made yourself the savior," she said in a low, venomous tone, "but I know what you're doing. You want to make me look unfit so you can crawl your way into favor. Do you imagine Mark will thank you? Do you imagine anyone will believe you over me?" Talia stood still, her hands clutching the folded sheets so tightly that her knuckles ached. "I don't want favor," she said quietly. "I want safety for him." Genevieve's laugh was sharp, almost manic. "Safety? You're the danger here. You brought strangers into my house. You let them cart my son away as if I were nothing. You betrayed the very family that feeds you, and for what? To play the martyr? To have people look at you with pity and call you brave? You filthy little schemer, you'll regret this." The venom in those words might have pierced her days earlier. But Talia had already learned something vital, that Genevieve's cruelty was rooted in fear, and that fear had less power when named. "I regret nothing," she replied evenly. "And if telling the truth makes me the villain in your eyes, then so be it. I'd rather be your villain than his undertaker." The confrontation ended when Eli cried out, a soft wail that sliced through their clashing words. Talia crossed the room instinctively, and Genevieve stepped in front of her, blocking the way. For a heartbeat, they stood inches apart, the child crying behind them, the air vibrating with tension. Then Genevieve's hand shot out and slapped Talia across the cheek. The sound cracked through the nursery like a gunshot. Talia staggered, clutching the sheets, her vision blurring for a moment. When she steadied herself, She saw not just Genevieve's trembling rage but Mrs. Pembroke standing in the doorway, watching. The older woman's expression was unreadable, but her words were razor-sharp. "Enough!" she snapped. "Both of you." Then, turning her gaze on Talia, she added with chilling precision, "You are dismissed from the nursery until further notice. You will not attend to Master Eli again unless instructed. Do you understand?" The bruise burning across her cheek seemed to pulse in time with Eli's cries, but Talia managed to straighten her spine. "I understand," she said, though what she understood was far deeper, that the house itself had chosen sides. That truth was being buried under wealth and fear, and that she would now be fighting for both the child's safety and her own survival. That night, in the narrow solitude of her attic room, she pressed a cool cloth against her cheek and thought of her mother's frail voice on the phone. She thought of the social worker's letter, of Nurse Alvarez's steady kindness, of James's whispered loyalty. And she thought of the security footage hidden in the cloud, waiting like an unlit lantern. She whispered into the silence, "You're not alone, Eli. I won't let them erase what happened." And in that whispered vow, she discovered something unshakable. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act while carrying it, again and again, no matter the cost. The broken silence, the day after the confrontation in the nursery, the entire house seemed to rearrange itself around Talia like a theater set built to isolate a single character. Doors that had once opened freely now closed when she approached. Chores she had once shared were reassigned, leaving her with the heaviest work, while others slipped away with lighter burdens. Even meals in the staff dining room became strained performances, forks clinking against plates too loudly, conversations that faltered when she entered. Rosa still managed to offer her quiet kindnesses, and extra rolls slipped onto her plate. A gentle touch on the shoulder, but the older maid's eyes carried warnings too, the kind that said, "They're watching you. They're waiting for you to break." Talia endured it because she had learned long ago that silence and pressure were weapons as sharp as knives, and because she refused to let the boy upstairs become collateral damage in a house obsessed with appearances. Her resolve was tested. Further, when the social worker arrived that week for a wellness check, the Rothwells had been informed, of course. Nothing ever happened in their world without advance warning. By the time the caseworker stepped through the grand front entrance, Genevieve had been transformed into a portrait of maternal devotion. Her hair gleamed in soft waves, her linen dress was simple but immaculate, and Eli sat balanced on her hip with a pacifier in his mouth and a stuffed bear in his arms. Mark hovered in the background, dignified and composed, his tongue clipped but courteous as he answered the caseworker's questions. Mrs. Pembroke moved in and out with the grace of a butler in a stage play, offering tea, arranging the seating, making sure the house itself whispered stability and wealth. Talia was not invited to the parlor for the conversation. She only heard snatches as she passed in the hallway, Genevieve's sweetly pitched voice insisting that the fall had been nothing more than a stumble during a restless nap. Mark's calm explanations about how quickly they had acted, Pembroke's interjections about how all staff are well-trained in discretion. The caseworker's voice was neutral, professional, giving nothing away. But when she emerged into the hallway, her eyes met Talia's for a fraction of a second, and in that glance Talia saw recognition. The woman had heard her name at the hospital, or perhaps read it in a report. The silence between them carried a question. "Will you speak?" That night, Talia wrestled with the choice. Speaking might mean her dismissal, her reputation tarnished, her mother's medical bills left unpaid. But staying silent would mean allowing lies to harden into truth, leaving Eli exposed to the very dangers she had witnessed. Her conscience did not give her the luxury of pretending neutrality. She thought of her mother's words during childhood, spoken whenever they watched court dramas on television. "The truth isn't fragile, Talia. It's stubborn. But sometimes it needs someone equally stubborn to carry it." That memory settled into her bones like steel. The next morning, she left the house early under the pretense of running an errand and walked to a coffee shop across from St. Joseph's Hospital. Elena, one of the pediatric nurses who had been present during Eli's admission, met her there. She was a compact woman with a brisk energy, her scrubs folded neatly under a hoodie. "You came," Elena said, sliding into the booth with a wary glance toward the windows. I wasn't sure you'd risk it. I don't have a choice, Talia admitted, wrapping her hands around the paper cup as if it could steady her. They're trying to make me invisible in that house. They want the story to vanish. But if I stay quiet, then it's like nothing happened at all, and she broke off, swallowing hard. He deserves more than silence. Elena's expression softened. I saw the state she was in that night, we all did. The odor in the room, the way she could barely stand. The other nurses noticed too. It wasn't just you. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. I can get statements. Not just mine, but from 2 others who were on shift. But you need to know, people like the Rothwells fight dirty. They'll use their lawyers, their money, their influence. This isn't going to be fair. I know, Talia said quietly. But fairness isn't what I'm after. I just want the truth in a place where it can't be buried. They exchanged numbers, and Elena promised to reach out again in a few days with written testimonies. When Talia left the coffee shop, a flicker of hope stirred inside her. It wasn't victory, but it was the beginning of a record, something that could withstand the Rothwells' endless attempts to rewrite the past. Back at Bonaventure, however, the atmosphere had grown even more poisonous. Genevieve avoided her entirely, but her absence from their encounters carried its own kind of menace. Mrs. Pembroke spoke to her only in clipped instructions. And more than once, Talia noticed James watching her nervously, as though he wanted to speak but feared the consequences. Finally, late one evening, he found her in the pantry polishing silver and blurted out, I overheard something. Mr. Rothwell had a meeting today with a man in a gray suit looked like security. They were talking about the cameras. Mrs. Rothwell asked for a reset. Talia froze, the fork in her hand catching the light. A reset? James nodded quickly. The man said it meant the old recordings would be gone from the house system. But he also mentioned something about cloud backups. I don't think they realized I was listening. Hope and dread collided in Talia's chest. If backups existed, they could prove everything. But if Genevieve and Pembroke knew that too, they would do everything in their power to block access. She forced her voice steady. You didn't hear wrong? No, James said, his face pale. I swear it. That night, lying awake in her narrow bed, Talia stared at the ceiling beams and pieced together her next steps. She had witnesses now, willing to testify to what they had seen and smelled. She had a lead on the missing footage, if only she could find a way to access it. And she had something even more dangerous than all that, Genevieve's growing hatred, sharp enough to wound in ways no physical slap could. The threat wasn't just to her livelihood anymore. It was to her safety, to her mother's security, to every fragile thread of stability she had managed to weave together. Yet as she turned onto her side, exhaustion finally creeping into her bones, she thought of Eli's small hand clutching her finger in the ambulance. That memory was stronger than fear. It was stronger than threats, stronger than lies. And in that moment, she made a promise to herself that no matter how many accusations were hurled, no matter how many punishments were laid at her feet, she would not abandon the fight. Because sometimes the only way to honor truth was to break the silence again and again, until it was loud enough that no one could ignore it. The price of truth. The Rothwell estate never slept easily after Eli's fall. Outwardly, the family carried on with its routines, the carefully staged dinners, the hushed luncheons with business associates, the rigid schedule of staff duties that moved like clockwork. But underneath, something had cracked, and everyone felt it. The silence in the halls was heavier, more dangerous. It was the silence of people waiting for the next blow to fall, for the next secret to slip into daylight. And for Talia, each day was a test of endurance, every glance and word from the others carrying the weight of judgment. Her punishment had not ended with exclusion from the nursery. Now she was saddled with endless inventories, assigned to scrub marble steps until her knees ached, and left to polish silver for hours while others slept. The message was clear. She was being pressed into submission, forced to remember her place. But the harder they pressed, the less inclined she felt to bow. Exhaustion gnawed at her, yes, but beneath it a quiet fire burned, one fueled by Eli's cries. by Elena's promise of testimony, by James's whispered warning about the camera. Reset. For Talia, every burden was no longer simply punishment. It was training. Training for the fight she knew was coming. That fight began to take shape when, one damp Thursday morning, a courier arrived with a sealed envelope addressed to her in immaculate script. Mrs. Pembroke delivered it personally, her lips pursed as though she were presenting not a letter, but a sentence. Inside was a legal document, a notice of pending complaint filed on behalf of Genevieve Rothwell. The allegations were as cruel as they were absurd claims of harassment. Insubordination, even emotional manipulation of a minor, Genevieve accused her of creating a dangerous environment, of poisoning the household with lies and fabrications. Reading those words in print made Talia's stomach twist, but what chilled her more was the calculated elegance of the language. It wasn't a mere tantrum, it was a strategy, crafted by lawyers who had done this before, sharpened like a blade meant to sever her from any chance of defense. She carried the letter to her small room and sat at the edge of the bed, the paper trembling in her hands. For years she had worked quietly, invisibly, doing everything she could to support her mother's treatments, to keep her dignity intact. Now, in a few paragraphs of legal jargon, her entire reputation was being rewritten into something monstrous. She thought of her mother reading such lies, of neighbors whispering, of her name dragged through mud by a family with endless resources. For a moment, despair pressed heavy against her chest. But then she remembered the flash drive James had slipped into her hand, the one containing the footage from the nursery before the reset. Proof, cold, undeniable proof. She had not looked at it yet. Fear of what it might show had kept her away, but now, with her character under assault, she understood she had no choice. That night, when the house had gone still, she closed her door and opened her old laptop. The drive hummed faintly as it loaded, and then the video filled the screen. The images were grainy but clear: Eli's tumble from the crib, the sharp cry of pain, Genevieve's staggering form swaying into view. The syringe glinted under the nursery light. The camera caught everything: her incoherent muttering, the tray of white powder on the table, the slap that had knocked Talia back into the crib. Every moment burned into digital permanence. By the time the recording ended, Talia sat trembling, a mix of horror and relief coursing through her. She had what she needed. But she also knew that possession of this evidence made her dangerous to the Rothwells, and danger in their world did not go unanswered. Her fears were confirmed 2 days later when she found a folded note slipped under her door. It contained a single photograph of her mother in her hospital bed, eyes wide and fearful, with a line scrawled across the back in curling script: "Tell them you lied, or she suffers." The words drained the blood from her face. It was no longer just about her survival, no longer even about Eli. Now the threat reached beyond the estate, clawing into her most vulnerable place. The Rothwells, or Genevieve, more precisely, had made it clear they would break her however they could. Shaken, she rushed into town that evening and met Elena again at the coffee shop. She laid the photograph on the table with trembling hands. Elena's face hardened as she read the message. "This isn't just intimidation, it's criminal. You need to take this to the police." "And if I do?" Talia asked, her voice frayed. "What happens to my mother in the meantime?" "They've already reached her once. If I provoke them, they could—" She couldn't finish the thought. Elena reached across the table and gripped her hand firmly. "Then you don't go alone. You bring us. You bring statements, testimony, and that footage. If they want to play, in shadows we drag everything into the light. People like them thrive on silence. Break it and they lose power." The words struck deep. Silence had always been the weapon of the estate, silence enforced by fear, silence that erased bruises and swallowed cries. And here was a nurse, someone with nothing to gain, telling her that the antidote was noise. Noise in the form of testimony, of evidence, of refusal to bow. For the first time, Talia felt the edges of a strategy forming. Back at Bonaventure, however, the storm was already gathering. Mark had grown colder, his interactions clipped to the point of cruelty. Genevieve, though rarely seen, left traces of her presence in mocking little gestures, perfume lingering in rooms she hadn't visited, a silk scarf draped deliberately across a banister as though reminding everyone she was still the mistress of the house despite her absence from daily routines. And Mrs. Pembroke shadowed Talia's every move, her smirk suggesting she knew more than she admitted. Late one evening, as Talia walked through the courtyard after extinguishing the lamps, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Genevieve herself emerging from the shadows, a dark coat pulled around her shoulders, eyes glittering with malice. Her smile was thin, wrong, the kind that revealed nothing but hunger. "You think a little video makes you safe?" she whispered. "It doesn't. It makes you visible. And visibility, my dear, is a dangerous thing for people like you." The words were meant to slice her down, to reduce her again to a servant who should have stayed silent. But Talia found herself straightening, meeting that venomous gaze without flinching. "If I'm visible," she said quietly, "it's because you left me no choice. You made silence impossible. And if being seen is dangerous, then so be it. I'd rather risk danger than carry your secrets." For a moment, Genevieve faltered, her smile flickering into something darker, rawer. Then she stepped back into the shadows, her perfume trailing like smoke. "We'll see," she hissed, and vanished into the night. Talia stood rooted for a long while after, the cold air biting at her skin, her heart pounding. She knew then that there was no turning back. The Rothwells had declared war not just in their home, not just in whispers, but in courts, in threats, in shadows that stretched beyond the estate. And if she wanted to survive, if she wanted to protect Eli and her mother and herself, she would have to fight with everything she had, not quietly, not invisibly, but loudly, stubbornly, and with the truth as her weapon. And as she returned to her room, she realized that the price of truth was steep reputation, safety, perhaps even freedom. But the price of silence was steeper still. It was a child left in harm's way, a mother left unprotected, a life swallowed by lies. And that, she decided with quiet certainty, was a price she would never pay. The evidence and betrayal. By the time autumn leaves began to scatter across the marble steps of the Rothwell estate, Talia had grown used to moving through the house as though she were walking a battlefield. Every corridor felt like a front line, every closed door a plotting chamber. The other staff carried themselves with the caution of survivors' polite nods, careful silences, hands busy with work but eyes darting away whenever hers tried to meet them. Even Rosa, usually warm and supportive, seemed more withdrawn, as though afraid that any kindness shown to Talia might be used as evidence of disloyalty. It was as though the house itself had decided she was dangerous, and everyone was choosing sides in a war no one dared name aloud. The footage on the flash drive had become both her shield and her burden. She carried it hidden in a hollowed-out book on her nightstand, terrified that at any moment someone might storm in and tear it from her hands. She had shown a copy to Elena, who had promised to keep it safe, and she knew the nurse had passed along word of it to others in quiet circles outside the estate. But possession was not enough. The Rothwells had resources that could bury her in legal motions, smear her reputation in the press, or worse, harm her mother who still lay fragile in a hospital bed. Talia realized that truth was only as powerful as the places it was planted. Evidence alone was like a seed. It needed soil in courts and witnesses. In the public eye, if it was ever going to grow strong enough to withstand the storm. Yet even as she began building that quiet alliance with Elena and the sympathetic social worker, danger was moving closer within the estate. James, the young footman who had slipped her the flash drive, had grown increasingly restless. His movements were nervous, his conversations cut short, and once Talia caught him avoiding her gaze altogether. When she confronted him one evening in the pantry, he blurted, "I think they suspect me. Mrs. Pembroke asked me 3 times today where I'd been the afternoon the security vendor came. She was watching my hands, my pockets, like she already knew." His voice cracked under the weight of his fear. Talia pressed a steadying hand to his arm. "Don't panic." "Say nothing more than you have to. You did the right thing, James. If they come after you, they'll only reveal how afraid they are of the truth." But she knew fear was a dangerous thing, and in a house like Bonaventure, Fear made people betray one another. Her suspicion proved right only a few nights later. She had just returned from visiting her mother at the hospital when she noticed something wrong in her room. The book on her nightstand had shifted slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough that her eyes caught it instantly. She opened it with trembling hands. The flash drive was gone. Panic flared hot through her chest. She tore through her belongings, but the truth was undeniable. The evidence that had been her shield was now in someone else's hands. Her mind raced through possibilities, but only one name settled with chilling certainty: James. He had been the only one who knew where the drive had come from. And if Pembroke had pressed him, if Genevieve had threatened him with the ruin of his position, perhaps even his family, then betrayal would not have required much more than fear. That night, as she lay awake staring into the dark, anger and sorrow warred within her. She had wanted to believe loyalty could survive inside that house, but perhaps she had been naive. Survival was the stronger force here, and James had chosen his own. The next morning confirmed her fear. In the corridor outside the nursery, she saw Pembroke speaking in hushed tones to Genevieve. Her hand closed around a small plastic case that could only be the flash drive. Genevieve's smile was sharp, triumphant, her eyes flicking toward Talia with a venom that made her stomach turn. She had what she wanted now, and she would use it to twist the narrative beyond recognition. But Talia was not as defenseless as Genevieve believed. Unknown to them, she had made a second copy, something Elena had urged her to do the night they first watched the footage together. That copy was already in the hands of someone outside the estate, a quiet insurance policy, in case the Rothwells moved against her. Watching Genevieve clutch the decoy drive with smug satisfaction, Talia realized the betrayal that had gutted her might yet become an advantage. Let them believe they had stolen her only weapon. The real blade was already elsewhere, sharper than ever. Still, the emotional wound of James's betrayal cut deep. That evening she found him alone in the servants' corridor, his face pale, his hands trembling. He opened his mouth to speak, but she silenced him with a look. "You chose," she said quietly, her voice carrying neither rage nor pity. "And now we both live with it." His eyes welled with regret, but she turned and walked away before he could answer. She knew better than to trust a conscience that only found its voice after the damage was done. The following week, events accelerated. Genevieve, emboldened by her supposed possession of the footage, began visiting the estate more openly, her silk robe swishing through the halls as though reclaiming territory. She cornered Talia once near the grand staircase, her perfume sharp and suffocating. "You thought you could trap me," she hissed, her voice low enough not to carry. "But now I hold your lies in my hand. When the court sees that file, they'll know exactly who you are, a manipulative little servant, desperate for attention, desperate to climb into a world that will never be yours." Talia held her gaze, steady and unflinching. "If you truly believe that drive proves your innocence, then I hope you show it to the judge. I hope you play every second of it. Because truth doesn't bend, Genevieve, it only breaks the ones who try to bury it." The sharpness of her reply unsettled the woman for a moment, but Genevieve quickly recovered, sneering as she swept away. Yet, in that brief flicker, Talia saw what she had always suspected. Beneath the cruelty and arrogance was fear, raw and gnawing. Fear of being unmasked. Meanwhile, Richard Rothwell, who had remained distant and cold through much of the ordeal, began to show cracks in his composure. He summoned Talia to his study late one night, his face drawn and tired, his whiskey glass half empty. "She's preparing to take this public," he said without preamble. "The suit isn't just against you. She intends to drag my name into it, to ruin us both." His eyes flicked to hers, searching. "If you have anything left, anything that can put this to rest, now is the time to give it to me." Talia considered him for a long moment. Here was a man who had threatened her, dismissed her, treated her as if her words were filth. And yet now, desperation softened him, bent his pride into a plea. She thought of Eli, innocent and still too young to understand the forces swirling around him. For his sake, if not for Richard's, she nodded. "You'll have it," she said. "But once the truth is shown, you cannot hide it again." Not for her, not for the family name, not for appearances. The truth must stand. Richard's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head in reluctant agreement. As she left the study, Talia felt a shift deep in her bones. The betrayal, the threats, the endless attempts to crush her had forged something unyielding inside her. She was no longer simply a maid fighting for her position. She was a witness, a protector, a voice for those silenced by wealth and fear. And though the battle ahead would be ruthless, she knew this. She had planted her truth in soil the Rothwells could not reach. Now it was only a matter of time before the storm broke, and the house of silence they had built came crashing down. The reckoning, the day of the hearing, dawned gray and heavy. The kind of morning when clouds pressed low against the earth, as though the city itself was waiting to see what would unfold. Talia rose before her alarm, her body taut with a nervous energy that made every breath shallow. She had spent the night rehearsing her words, steadying herself with the memory of Eli's cry and the promise she had whispered into silence weeks before, that she would not let lies become his inheritance. As she dressed in her plainest but neatest clothes, a simple blouse, a dark skirt that still carried the faint smell of starch, she felt the gravity of every step she was about to take. Today, silence would no longer be her burden. Today, silence would belong to the Rothwells. At the courthouse, the air was thick with the smell of paper and old wood polish, the hum of voices blending with the shuffle of shoes across marble floors. Reporters lingered near the entrance, their pens and cameras poised, sniffing for scandal. Talia kept her head high as she entered, flanked by Elena and two other nurses who had agreed to testify. Their presence gave her strength, a reminder that truth was not hers alone to carry anymore. Across the hallway, Genevieve swept in like a storm cloud wrapped in silk. Her makeup was flawless, her expression polished into composure, but her eyes gleamed with malice. At her side walked a team of lawyers, their briefcases bulging with carefully crafted narratives meant to erase reality. When the proceedings began, the courtroom settled into a tense rhythm. Genevieve's attorneys painted a portrait of Talia as a manipulative servant who had interfered in private family matters, a woman of questionable motives who had weaponized a child's cry for personal gain. Their words dripped with disdain, designed not only to discredit her actions but to crush her very identity. Talia sat still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, forcing herself not to flinch. She had expected to be cast as villain in a story she had only ever tried to rewrite with truth.